Good evening, Happy New Year, and I'm going to switch right into the English language so that our guest tonight can understand us from the very beginning. It gives me great pleasure to be able to introduce to you my, I think I can say, friend, Matt McCaffrey, a young Austrian scholar, a very promising one. Watch him in the future. He will speak today about the possible application of praxeology as the broad framework of Austrian analysis into other areas besides economics. I'm not going to steal a great amount of your time. Let me say a few words about him. Then I will give him the floor. He will speak roughly around half an hour or so. And then questions are welcomed. And after a fair amount of time, we will call it off. Matthew teaches at the University of Illinois at Springfield. He thought he teaches courses on various economic aspects. A few lectures on economic issues. He also teaches an interesting course on what is good. He also taught at the University of Auburn. He was for a long time associated with the Mises Institute in Auburn in Alabama, as he had his research undertaken there. He recently completed his PhD in France at Angers with Professor Hülsmann, and he wrote a thesis on the theory of the political economy of moral hazard. He wrote quite a bit on various interesting issues. I recommend his articles to you on issues like moral hazard, incentives, the theory of entrepreneurship, the theory of political entrepreneurship, history of economic thought, monetary theory, history of monetary thought, so on and so forth. And he has very interesting new ideas that he will write about in the future. So that having been said, let me give the floor to Matt, and I'm sure we have a very nice evening together. Matt, please.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you especially to Vlad and Tudor for inviting me to give this little lecture, and to talk about one of my most favorite things in the world, the art of war, which we'll get to. Let me say that what I'm talking about tonight is a part of an ongoing research project and a series of papers that I'm developing. They're in various stages of completion, one of which is forthcoming. That I can certainly send you if you happen to be interested in it. But they tend to deal with, as Vlad said, how we can extend what we call praxeological reasoning to areas in which it really hasn't been pushed yet. So let me just start with the basics. Praxeology, as you probably know, is the more general science of human action. It's the notion of human purpose that we use as a foundation to basically develop all of the social sciences. Economists, or particularly Austrian economists, very often use praxeology almost synonymously with economics, but as Mises, for example, says, economics is merely one branch of the broader field of praxeology, although, as he says, it is the best developed branch up to now. And this is true just as when Mises originally wrote this. But some other people have commented on this as well, about the lack of other developed branches of a science of human action. And here we have Rothbard talking about how, talking about some of the other branches of praxeology, violent action and interaction, and of course he mentions the logical theory of war, which is a part of what I'll be talking about tonight. And further after continue on in this quote, he also mentions game theory and theories of voting and things like this, other ways that we can think about human action that aren't strictly economic, although there may be some overlap, as I'll discuss. But as he says, the rest of praxeology is an unexplored area, and so what I've been interested in recently is applying praxeological ideas to other fields, and in particular, the field of strategy. So I'll talk about it in a moment. Before we get to that, I hope this isn't too small for people to read, but here's a visualization of this notion of the sciences of human action, and it includes a distinction made by Mises and others between praxeology and thymology, where thymology is more about our historical understanding in the empirical world, whereas praxeology deals more with the stricter implications of what it means to choose and what it means to have purpose and so on. And so you can see the distinction where we have the economic subjects on the one hand, but of course what I'm interested in talking about tonight are these other branches of praxeology that exist independent of economics. So for example, you have things like praxeological ethics, if you're into that sort of thing, but also game theory and a theory of war as well. And what I'm going to talk about is, in a way, a combination of the game theory aspect and the theory of war. I would actually modify this slightly to include strategy in its broadest, most general sense, which would include elements of game theory, theories of war, and things like that. But I'll talk about those in a little bit. So the motivating question behind this research is that are there universal principles of strategy? If praxeology is universal, and in economics we certainly say that it is, if there are universal economic principles, are there praxeological other universal principles in the other branches of praxeology as well? And we would expect that there would be. So if we're talking about strategic decision making, can we also draw some inferences about what those principles might look like? Just as a sort of rough and ready definition of strategy as decision making within some situation of conflict or confrontation, a couple of important things to think about when we talk about strategy in its broadest sense. Usually we are talking about some kind of competition, and particularly competition between acting, purposive, and opposing sides. It doesn't make too much sense to talk about strategic decision making if there's only one person acting. That would fall into some other branch of reasoning. But in any case, and in addition to the conflict between more than one party, it's also very important to note that when we talk about strategy, we have to include both planning and execution of strategies. Just as in economics, we have to always take into account the real world and the fact that when we act in the real world, we necessarily incur certain costs. We have to deal with the issue of scarcity, which I'll also talk about. And basically you have to take into account the limitations of the real world. It's strategy, like economics, is about more than ideas. At some point the ideas have to actually materialize in the real world. Now, related to strategy, we'll talk about game theory quickly. So game theory is essentially a branch of strategy in its broadest sense, dealing with very specific types of strategy, usually in the context of very well-defined rules. But I will say that game theory is a branch of praxeology in the traditional sense that Austrian economists have considered it. Murray Rothbard, for example, in one of his early American Economic Review articles, lists game theory as a branch of praxeology. Game theory in the way it was developed early on by John von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern. But the problem that Austrian economists have often had with game theory is that it tends to be unrealistic, at least when it's applied to economic reasoning. So the usual problems of subjectivity and uncertainty and entrepreneurial behavior, these tend not to have much of a place in game theory. It tends to have a very difficult time incorporating them. And so for this, and what I would argue is that you see the same problems emerge in the field of strategy as well, in the sense that if you ever wanted to apply principles of strategic decision making to the real world, you would also have to do away with unrealistic assumptions, like that there are fixed rules of the game that everybody has to act within, which would apply to a restrictive situation, like if you're playing chess or something. There are you can't, flip over the board and say I win. But obviously that sort of restricted environment doesn't exist in a lot of broader strategic decision-making situations, just as it doesn't exist in economics. And then finally, I just want to mention also war-making. What I'm going to talk about tonight will combine elements of what we might call like a pure strategy with the notion of war-making. But war-making would only be one branch of strategic decision-making, along with things like business strategy as well. But war-making would concerns the narrower case of armed conflict, typically between states. But it is, I just want to point out that it is only one branch of strategic thinking, although a lot of what I'll talk about tonight I think would apply to the specific case of war-making. And to just drive this point home, I have a quote here from Joseph Salerno, who this is actually quite a nice article that he published a few years ago. It's a little bit underrated in my opinion, but who discusses this notion of war-making as a purposive behavior, and the idea that if we ever want to analyze any kind of science of war-making, any logic of how wars take place, we have to begin with the very important point that things like wars and armed conflicts, they're not acts of nature. They are, in fact, the result of human choice and human purpose. And this is, I think, true not only of the narrower case of war-making, but also of the broader case of strategy in general. I think with both, we have to begin with some notion of human purpose. We have to begin with some notion of a goal to be achieved, a greater state of satisfaction that can be obtained through careful strategic decision making. So now we're returning to the question I posed before about sort of universal principles of strategy. The big problem we face is how can we conceptualize strategic decision making in a way that is basically consistent with praxeology as understood by Austrian economists. And the route that I've taken with this is to look back at some classic works in strategy, particularly in military strategy, and to see if they actually have any insights that seem compatible with the much more recent Austrian tradition in praxeology. And I think that they very often do have very important insights that we can use to think about more contemporary problems. So this brings me to Sun Tzu's Art of War. This is just on a personal note, this is one of my favorite books. Whenever I think about it, I'm reminded of a story that Robert Nozick tells in his autobiography, where he says that he was about 15 or 16 years old, and he discovered a copy of Plato's Republic, and he said he used to carry it around with him in the streets of Brooklyn with the front cover facing out so that everybody could see it. And he said, I had read very little of it, and I had understood none of it, but I knew that I had found something wonderful. And I bring this up not to compare myself to Nozick, but to point out that I feel very much the same way about this book. I discovered it when I was young, and I find it absolutely fascinating. And so I'm very happy to be able to incorporate it into my academic research. But just sort of some background, if you're not familiar with this. The Art of War, I think, is almost universally well known. It's the most famous of a series of 7 military classics that are regarded as canonical in the ancient Chinese literature. And it's enjoyed an enormous influence in both China and Japan, in both the market business context and the military conflict area. So it's been highly influential. And it's also experienced a sort of a renaissance at least the United States, in business culture, particularly in the 1980s when Japanese business culture was starting to appear more in the United States because, of course, at the time they were going through a very big economic boom. But they brought with them a lot of sort of cultural aspects of their business, and so American businessmen tried to sort of emulate many of the ideas that were circulating in their business culture, many of which relate to these strategic classics. Just on a historical note, the text itself, it's attributed to about the late 6th century BC. It's very old. Like a lot of these historical texts, there's a huge disagreement among scholars about when it was actually written, or more accurately, when it was compiled, because a lot of the records are very sketchy, and it's extremely unlikely that the man we know as the historical Sun Tzu actually wrote this text. More likely it was compiled later by his disciples. And partly because of this confused historical record, and because the text was likely compiled over the course of a relatively long period of time, it has a lot of philosophical influences, some of which conflict with each other. In general, though, the scholarly consensus is that the book is most heavily influenced by philosophical Taoism. It is not what you would call a Taoist text, but there are very important elements in it which can be linked to Taoist philosophy, particularly ideas about how strategy must be infinitely adaptable, even formless, like water. This is a theme that occurs prominently in the Tao. But in any case, what has become the canonical version of it that we have today does seem to be very much within this tradition. So I thought it was important to bring that up. Now, contrary to the name of the text, or the received name, Art of War is actually not so much about practical military matters as it is a much broader explanation of the essence of strategy. What it really tries to get at is not so much the minor points of how you maneuver on a battlefield or how you arrange troops and things like that. What it really is about is a series of very general, in fact universal principles that are capable of describing effectively any conceivable strategic situation. And the idea is that if you understand these principles and if you are capable of applying them to the situations where they are relevant, the victory, whatever that might mean, whatever specific context you're working in, is always achievable. And the key is to make conditions conducive to victory by carefully analyzing them, and again, carefully applying a series of principles, some of which I'll talk about. I would also point out that within this context, as I said, there are notions of adaptability and formlessness and so on. The reason those are there is because the text emphasizes very much that the conditions in which strategy is formed are always open-ended. They're always in continual flux, and I've used some of the military examples here, things like information and the morale of the troops, the morale of your own troops, as I'll discuss. Self-knowledge is also a very important part of this. But all of these different characteristics, these different conditions that can go into forming a strategy, constantly change. And so you have to be capable of perceiving that change before it happens, anticipating it, in order to form your own strategy and hopefully best your opponent. So this is just a little sort of a brief general description of what the book's all about. So now I'll talk about some of the more specific principles. I should point out that I do have to make a caveat. When you compare a book like Art of War to contemporary Austrian economics and Praxeology, of course, these two different texts come from very different epistemological, philosophical traditions. So it wouldn't be quite right to describe Sun Tzu as a sort of proto-praxeologist and say that he was anticipating these ideas. The traditions are very different. But what I want to argue is that they are similar enough on the essentials that we can draw some interesting analogies that do tell us something. But let me say that Sun Tzu actually starts, when talking about strategy in a general sense, he starts from a very similar place as economists do, that is with the idea of scarcity. He's very focused on the idea that executing any strategy, even the strategy of basically doing nothing, requires the use of scarce resources. Human and physical resources are always necessary, because as I mentioned before, when we talk about strategy, we have to talk about behavior in the real world. We're not just talking about sort of spinning out abstract ideas. There's the abstract in strategy really doesn't matter much. What matters is when decisions are actually made and become concrete. But in any case, as I said, the vital details of any process of forming and executing a strategy always take place in the context of scarcity, and this is something Sun Tzu is very interested in. Of course, scarcity, it always limits our potential, right? Because if you have, because all the relevant details, again, are always going to be scarce. It's not the case that you can make an abstract movement against an opponent. Rather, again, returning to the military context, you have to, say, deploy a very specific number and disposition of troops at a very specific place at a very specific time. Again, once again, it's all about resource use and carefully managing one's scarce resources. Interestingly, there is actually a very strong entrepreneurial element in the way Sun Tzu describes how to formulate good strategy. What he says, he talks quite a bit about how to creatively get around these seeming limitations that scarcity imposes on us. I talk about this in a forthcoming paper, this sort of entrepreneurial element, how much he emphasizes the creativity and the innovation that are constantly required to get around scarcity, particularly when your opponent is not equally creative and doesn't perceive the same opportunities you do to take advantage of the conditions on the battlefield. I sort of mentioned some of this already, but there's a distinctly economic point of view in Art of War. The vast majority of it revolves around, again, resource management, how to very carefully husband scarce resources. In fact, in one of the opening chapters, the second chapter, which is titled Waging War, in fact deals almost not at all with any sort of practical military problem. It's all about the costs of war, and particularly how to manage those costs, so as to not bankrupt the state through a process of careless warfare or indefinite warfare, extended campaigns, and so on. But this notion of the economic point of view, I think it's summed up nicely in this quote when he says that the essence of good strategy, the essence of fighting, is preservation. And there are certain reasons for that. As I said, this is since the text is influenced by Taoism, there's a certain notion for respect for life. So it's good to preserve resources in that sense. Also, there's a practical problem here, which is that if you destroy your enemy, whether it be the enemy's army or fortified cities or whatever, you're destroying exactly what you're supposed to be capturing. And Pyrrhic victories for Sun Tzu are not really victories at all. The conclusion that he reaches from this, and it's one of the most important ideas that comes out of Art of War, is that the highest goal of any strategy, particularly in the military context, is to win without actually fighting. The notion is that if a strategy is excellent enough and can be put into practice in just the right way, it can be so effective that an opponent is simply unable to make any sort of counter move. And is defeated before any sort of fight actually begins. And I love this line a lot when he says that all I need to do is draw a line on the ground and defend it. Because the idea being that if strategy is so perfect there's just nothing an opponent can do. You don't need fortifications if your enemy has been so limited by your strategic decision making that he can't leave his own country or can't engage you in battle or what have you. But once again, the theme of preservation is really dominant in the art of war, and I think it fits nicely with how we think of economics. Where are we? So the next big point of art of war is knowledge. In fact, it's probably the most common idea that you see repeated again and again in the text. The notion of possessing the right knowledge, what we might call the particular knowledge of time and place. That's what strategy is about. Because again, we're always dealing with the real world where time is scarce, where resources are scarce. And thus, what is a good strategy today may not be a good strategy tomorrow, because the conditions in which we form strategy are constantly changing. This is the most famous quotation from the Art of War, actually. Thus it is said that one who knows the enemy and knows himself will not be endangered in 100 engagements. And I think it sums up the principle quite well. But also notice that there's a distinct emphasis on the fact that knowledge isn't just a knowledge of external things. It's not just a knowledge of what one's opponent is doing. Self-knowledge is absolutely vital. It's indispensable. Because if you do not possess self-knowledge, you have absolutely no idea what you have to offer against a strategic opponent. And of course, when I talk about knowledge, as it says here, it's much deeper than simply gathering data, crunching numbers, and so on. And this comes back to the entrepreneurial element, or what I call the entrepreneurial element, that it involves a much deeper perception of what's going on in the world, of the availability of resources, how they can be used in very special ways to stymie an opponent, and so on. Related to this is actually more of a minor thing, but the use of spies is also a very important part of this. Art of War is actually the oldest known historical work that contains an analysis of spies and their importance and how to use spies. This is an idea that comes up a lot in the sort of business literature that's grown up around Art of War. The metaphor of using spies in business for like industrial espionage and things like that. We don't have to take the metaphor that far, but just to point out that I think a function like spying can be absolutely vital for obtaining information that leads to greater knowledge about what one's opponent is doing. And in fact, Sun Tzu's explanation of this it's the final chapter of the Art of War, is quite prescient in the sense that he understands the many risks of using spies, because he understands that spies can be turned and turned again, and so he understands that the value of the spy is greatly going to depend not just on the knowledge that he possesses, but on your expectations about the spy's behavior and whether or not your opponent will turn the spy and so on. I find it fascinating. He goes into a great deal of detail about this. But the notion of spying gets us to the flip side of knowledge, which is deception, another very important, very quoted theme from Art of War. Of course, if knowledge does play a significant role in forming a good strategy, well then sort of non-knowledge, anti-knowledge for one's opponent is also going to play a pretty big role. As I said, what I was trying to get at here is that if you have a situation like, say, perfect information in economics, but if in strategy, if you have a situation where knowledge is complete or perfect in some sense, what that does is really cause inaction in a way. What you end up describing is simply a static state where nothing can really change, because if both sides know everything there is to know, there's really not much you can do, right? You can either you get stuck in inaction, or in, say, in a military context, you end up sort of mindlessly pursuing conflict, even when it doesn't make much sense. But so in order to manipulate the situation, you have to be able to manipulate information for your opponent and deceive your opponent. Constantly keep the enemy on its toes, so to speak, by feeding them misinformation about what you're doing and how you're doing it. Again, returning to a sort of entrepreneurial idea, the twin notions of knowledge and deception also imply the sort of mutual adjustment of plans and expectations between opponents. Both sides are constantly in this process of trying to gather information and prevent deception, while at the same time encouraging exactly the opposite with their opponent. So this is the sort of element of pure strategy that describes conflicting intentions of opposing parties. Next, the notion of unorthodox strategy. This is actually a vital part of the art of war, although it is not quoted as much as some of the other passages. But Sun Tzu draws a really important distinction, and this is a distinction that has a very long history in Chinese military and business affairs. The distinction between these twin concepts, unorthodox and orthodox, that's how they've been translated, like many of these ancient concepts from Eastern philosophy. They're basically impossible to translate, but this is the best we've come up with for the moment. But you can see through these characteristics how they might play into strategy. The idea being that the use of an unorthodox strategy will always be superior to the use of an orthodox one. The orthodox, because it is so expected, because it is conventional, is also very easy to defend against. It's very easy to account for. But to be unorthodox is to defy expectations, to get around them, and thus, hopefully, to achieve some kind of victory. These two concepts, they have a very interesting relationship to each other. As it says, any situation of conflict and strategy and decision-making has its orthodox and unorthodox aspects. Any situation can be perceived, according to Sun Tzu, as both of these things. And more importantly, the two change constantly. Once again, as people's knowledge and expectations are updated, the orthodox becomes the unorthodox and vice versa. So the first time you use a daring battlefield tactic, you might be able to win the day, but after that, its effects are going to be much lower because your opponent will simply expect it. But then, maybe the sort of strategy that was originally very conventional becomes unexpected and becomes becomes unorthodox, and so can be effectively used in a strategic situation. So once again, as I said, the relationship between these two concepts is quite complex, but it's very important. And again, it's an attempt by Sun Tzu to get at a sort of a universal principle of strategy that can be applied to any situation. So those, I've only quoted a few passages and I've only talked about a few principles. I could have spoken for much longer, but I think it's more profitable to leave it here. But what I want to emphasize with this is that I do think that some of these great classics of strategy have a lot to say about strategic decision-making in a more universal sense, in a sense that's not the same as, but is compatible with praxeology as the Austrian economists have conceived of it. I do think there's a lot to learn from this. Again, I only talked about art of war. Even within the Chinese military tradition, I could have talked about a number of other texts, to say nothing of the Japanese, to say nothing of the Germans, the British, and the other nations, strategic traditions that have produced really important works. But again, I would like to focus on the fact that the principles I talked about, they can be linked to the notion of purposive behavior. Once we start with the idea that there was some sort of confrontation or conflict that we want to advantageously resolve through a careful strategy, a lot of these principles come very naturally. The idea of knowing more than your opponent does, the idea of deceiving your opponent and behaving in an unorthodox fashion. These come quite easily, I think, to strategic thinking. And as a last point, again, the principles that are outlined in books like Art of War, such that deception is a very important aspect of strategy, those are in a sense simple, and in fact they're almost trivial. They're not really news to anybody, but the key point is understanding how they can be applied to each particular situation, understanding which principles apply at each very specific time, anticipating that, and being able to then apply a particular principle in a particular time and place. So that's really the great challenge of strategy in Sun Tzu's view. But with that, I think I'll just I'll leave it at that, and I hope I managed to make some sense out of this. But if you don't mind, I'll answer some questions.
Then we moderate questions. And any questions from the audience? Yes, please.
I will have one.
Please. Thanks. First there. There's the first one I saw, and then the second there.
I have a curiosity.
Louder, please.
I have a curiosity. I'm not an expert in game theory or something like that. But how? I mean, you find this keyword strategies, but it's not quite exactly what you find in theory of war. I mean, when I'm speaking about strategies in game theory, I'm thinking about payoffs, about ultimatum games and stuff like that are more mathematical. And I don't know how you make the connection with theory of war with strategies. I mean, maybe you have the same word but two different meanings, or it's I misunderstood.
So, what's the difference between game theory strategy and praxeological strategy?
If it's every.
Yeah, I think I see what you're saying. So I think the idea is that all of the game theory, war-making, strategy in the broadest sense, they all share some overlap, but they all have also some distinct characteristics. But the thing is, what unites them, or at least in my view, is the notion of human purpose. That's what they all share in common. So for example, it is very true that a conventional game theory approach, especially in mathematical economics, is not what you would see in practical military decisions in wartime. However, I think if you think about them within the broader framework of praxeology, you realize that there is actually overlap. And as I said, the key point is human purpose. Because whether you're playing chess or solving a prisoner's dilemma or making war or engaging in strategic management, in all cases, we're talking about action, we're talking about purpose and choice with the ultimate goal of some increased welfare or obtaining something, somehow improving our position. So.
Only one back and forth. Okay. Once. Okay.
So you think that we will some kind of a path to a goal, actually, both the strategies, game theory and the theory of war?
Okay, again, also interesting. Like, I think that the way mathematical economics uses strategy, no. The way that it is currently conceived of, no, it would not be quite a part of this, although there might be some overlap. The reason being that most game theoretic approaches in economics have this sort of static element to them, where the payoffs are fixed, and both parties presumably know something about the payoffs, and so on. And really, strategy, in the economic sense, is already implied in the conditions of the problem. Once you've constructed the conditions of the problem, you know what the optimal strategy is, right? And hence, the emergence of optimal equilibria. But again, it's static in the sense that there's not this constantly changing environment in which you need to make decisions. There's not an uncertain environment. But yes, I mean, I see what you're getting at, and there are different meanings of this term strategy. So, yeah.
The next question?
I want
Loud.
to ask you if you got to read the On War by Carbon Clausewitz, and if yes, if we could make a link between the concept of the father of war with the concept of
he don't have?
It's interesting. There's actually some,
Invisible hand.
as far as
Invisible hand. Okay.
yeah. There is actually some literature on this. As far as Clausewitz is concerned, I think On War is a little bit more practical than Sun Tzu is, because as I was trying to emphasize, Sun Tzu is really about the broader principles of war in the broadest sense, whereas I think Clausewitz is narrower and wants to talk more about details, like technological details, logistical details of his particular time period. So I think that he is probably less useful for this than Sun Tzu is. But I do think that there's value in what he wrote, and he also is what what they call in the literature grand theories of war. Clausewitz has them too. So there is a relationship between here that's worth exploring. He was also very interested in the notion of time and things like that that we can make with which we can make comparisons not only to Sun Tzu but to economics as well. So as far as the invisible hand itself is concerned, I'm not sure I see a specific connection. No.
Other questions, please?
Going back to your slide on deception, you said that if you know your opponent completely and the opponent knows you completely, that's undesirable because it can lead either to no action or direct conflict. But let's take an example. For example, there's side A, which is completely strong from all points of view, and side B, who is very, very weak. I would dare to say that for side A, this complete knowledge of your opponent and them knowing you completely is very advantageous because it can lead to that situation where you have no conflict but you win. You don't fight. Why would you say
That's an excellent question, actually. The reason is because it comes back especially to the notion of the orthodox and the unorthodox. Because for Sun Tzu, there's basically no such thing as a hopeless situation. If you are effective enough, you can find your way out of trouble. And in fact, not just in the Art of War, but in many of the Chinese military classics, they spend a lot of time talking about sort of impossible situations. So what if we're outnumbered and we're surrounded and the terrain is terrible and so on and so forth. So the idea is that if both sides have complete knowledge, they would also have knowledge of these orthodox and unorthodox strategies, for example. And so they would still be forced either to like mindlessly attack each other or simply do nothing, precisely because even the small opponent has available strategies that could bring about victory.
Okay, so there's no, if you can't beat them, join them course of action in this situation.
Well, cooperation is also possible. That is among the strategies, or at least cooperation, assuming there are more than two opponents. For the for pedagogical reasons, I guess you might say. In a case where there are only two opponents, they don't talk about cooperation because it's just kind of assumed that if you could cooperate, you would be doing it already. So the only kind of cooperation that comes out of a situation with two opponents would be when one side has effectively defeated or cowed the other side into submission. So I hope that answers your question.
So I have more of a curiosity than a question. I observed that usually Austrian economics say that praxeology is a much broader science than economics, but the curious thing is that the only relevant findings that the praxeology, the science, are in the realm of economics. So we have cycle theory, we have calculation theory, which are things which are not trivial and are much further, much more complex than just saying that people act and this is purposeful behavior. So of course I don't want to say that praxeology cannot be applied in other domains than economics, but I'm curious whether if we apply it, we will have relevant findings like the ones we have in economics.
Some more specific theoretical implications.
Yes.
Yeah.
Theorems.
Not trivial findings.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question, and I actually agree with you that it is. I mean, economics is the so-called best developed branch of praxeology precisely because it's the easiest to spin out, as you said, non-trivial, substantive implications about the world. But I do think that it can be applied in other realms as well. For example, to take the branch of strategy dealing with like business management or business strategy, strategic management, strategic entrepreneurship, and things like that. I think we can get some interesting things out of those branches, and it's precisely because they contain so much more than, as you said, the trivial implications that everybody talks about, like people act, and so we're always trying to improve our situations and so on, like the very basic ideas that people associate with praxeology. But of course, it is so much more than that. But I do think that it is sort of a great undiscovered country that we can get things out of.
Okay, some other questions? I have two in store, so maybe you figure out others. The first question would be, when I think about Rothbard, speaking in The Ethics of Liberty, in For a New Liberty, and in a few other articles, when he speaks about strategy, he mostly has in mind the idea, the political idea, of switching from a relatively more statist society to a relatively more non-statist or private property order-like society. Is there any connection or parallel or overlapping or relation between his way of seeing strategy and your way of seeing it? And if so, what could we learn from studying strategy, praxeological strategies such as explained by Sun Tzu, to apply in a strategy for freedom, let's say, for more freedom?
It's another great question, and I actually have a working paper on exactly this topic, although I don't finish it because on some level I feel like I'm not old enough to be talking about telling other people what this great strategy for liberty should be, but I'm still writing the paper anyway. But I do actually think that that this does tell us, or it can tell us a lot about strategies for liberty, if for no other reason than that it can tell us about strategies that won't be effective. So just to take a couple of different examples, the focus on scarcity, right? In any strategy for liberty, we have to look at the resources available to both sides. Obviously, the more liberty-oriented side not only has fewer resources, but its resources are actually siphoned off and then used against it by the more statist side, right? So this sort of implication, I mean, it's absolutely vital to think about it like this way. So and I think we can use these ideas to get at the notion of entrepreneurial strategy and how we can get around those resource constraints. That would be one example. Another favorite that I've been thinking about is the notion of the use of spies, right? Like, I'm not sure exactly what a spy would be like in the context of a struggle for liberty. Maybe we spend liberals into government to report back.
A professor in the state university.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting you bring up that example though, because I think Sun Tzu actually has the answer for why we don't do that or why we shouldn't do that, and it's because spies can be turned. And so I'm sure you can appreciate the relevant analogy. But again, it's a simple insight, but it's very important, right? It should explain why it doesn't make sense to, again, I'm thinking off the top of my head here, but why it might not make sense to, train economists to go and, become on the board of a central bank and sort of report back to us, precisely because in order to get there, you pretty much have to guarantee that you've already been turned in a way. So again, just sort of the calculus involved in that. But I think there are a number of other ways you can think about this sort of strategy in terms of a strategy for liberty as well, both in terms of positive, what we should do, and negative, the strategies we really need to avoid.
My second question is related to this Rothbardian theory of aggression,
Mhm.
which would make someone uncomfortable to make a parallel between, let's say, business strategy,
Yeah.
in which you always have to use, let's say, peaceful means,
Mhm.
and war making, in which anything is accepted.
Yeah.
In the end. So, what lessons can you draw from war making for business strategy? If in war making aggression is acceptable, you can kill people, you can torture people, you can strangle people, you can deceive people to the fullest extent possible, and business strategy where you can do lots of things but not aggressive,
Right.
which limits your means very much.
Yeah, again, another good question, and this is why I emphasize the difference that strategy, in the broader sense, isn't quite the same as war making or strategy for war making. I think the way to think about it is that, especially historically, a lot of people have thought about applying this text to business in the wrong way. That is, they conceive of this text as being fundamentally about war, and they say, how can we apply the theory of actual aggressive war to peaceful business? But I think that's a mistake, and I think that a better way to think about it would be to think about this as strategy in the broad sense, which again has different branches. So it's not the case that the principles of war actually apply to business strategy. It's that the broader principles of strategy can apply in both a business and a warfare context. So.
Some other questions? Maybe? Okay. Tudo, please.
Okay, so my question would be related to how would you comment on how is this let's say strategy or military strategy, or more specifically what Sun Tzu is commenting in the Art of War. So how is this related to calculated action? So to the kind of enterprise that needs market prices. Why am I asking this? Because I'm relating it to what Mises has to say about economic calculation under socialism. So in the case you have a military action, you do you presuppose that there are prices there or not? And if not, how can you still act in a very large, let's say, manner? How come you make something on a large scale and long term?
Yeah, it's a good, and again, good question. And I'm not just saying that because it is a good question. But this is actually something I talk about in my forthcoming paper on the art of war. Because, as you said, it's correct. Like military action, or at least in the context of a state, occurs outside the sphere of economic calculation. And it's, even though, of course, Sun Tzu was writing millennia before those terms were conceived, what he does spend a lot of time talking about are the principles of organization. And basically, he comes to the conclusions that modern management theory has reached, which is that when you don't have prices to guide you, you need to rely on incentives, specifically complex and properly organized schemes of reward and punishment, from all through the military hierarchy, because that's what you have to rely on, and it's also very clear in the art of war that is imperfect, but yeah, I mean I think it's a prescient insight, even though of course he lacked any kind of knowledge about what economic calculation is and so on. But yeah, it's about the internal organization of whatever it might be, the military or maybe the firm, but the notion of the careful arrangement of incentives.
Any other questions? If not, we can wrap it up here. Thank you, Matt, very much. If you have anything to add?
No, I don't think so. But I thank you all again for coming, and this is very interesting, and I'm very happy to talk with any of you about this if you want to talk about it after or anything like that. So I'd be more than welcome. But thank you all for coming. I did very much appreciate it. So.